You've probably seen it on a bumper sticker, maybe on a t-shirt. 3 words: Jesus is Lord. It reads like a nice, safe statement of personal belief, the kind of thing that goes on a coffee mug next to a verse about peace. In the city where those words were first written down, that sentence could get you killed. Not could get you in trouble, could get you arrested, tortured, and burned alive, and used as a street lamp. I want to tell you about the letter where that phrase shows up. The emperor who was on the throne when it was written, and why 3 words that sound like a bumper sticker to us sounded like treason to them. Welcome to Now It Makes Sense. I'm Dr. William Attaway, and this is the show where we go back into the world the Bible was actually written in, so that what these ancient words meant then can finally make sense now. No background required, no prior faith assumed, just honest questions, and a story far more dangerous than most of us were ever told. So let's set the scene. The Apostle Paul writes a letter to a church in the city of Ephesus. And Ephesus is not some sleepy backwater that you've never heard of. It's one of the largest, wealthiest cities in the entire Roman Empire. A major port, a hub of trade and travel, and home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a massive temple to the goddess Artemis, 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Athens. People came from all over the empire just to see it. This is a city obsessed with power, status, and being on the right side of Rome. And here's the detail most people miss when they read this letter. Paul isn't writing it from a comfortable study with a nice view. He's writing it from prison. He says so himself later in the letter. He calls himself a prisoner for the Lord. Whatever freedom he had before, he doesn't have it now. He's writing to this wealthy, status-conscious city while sitting in chains, under the authority of the very empire that put him there. Before Paul gets to the phrase we're building toward, he does something worth sitting with for a second. He tells the Ephesians he hasn't stopped thanking God for them, and he hasn't stopped praying for them either. Specifically, that, quote, the eyes of your heart would be enlightened, so they could grasp the hope that they have been called to, and the riches of what they've actually been given. This is not throat clearing before the real content starts. That request is the point of this whole letter. Paul isn't asking God to hand the Ephesians new information they didn't have. He's asking God to help them see something that's already true, whether or not it feels true from inside a city that answers to Nero. And what he wants their newly opened eyes to land on next is the phrase we're about to unpack. And listen to what he actually writes. Paul prays that the Ephesians would understand the scale of power available to them, quote, through Christ, who God raised from the dead and seated at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. Now, read quickly, that sounds like devotional language, encouragement, a nice thought about how big God is. But slow down on one phrase: far above all rule and authority. That's not a vague statement about spiritual power in general. In the first century, rule and authority had a very specific, very concrete referent. It meant Rome. It meant the emperor. It meant the entire chain of command that ran from the emperor down to the soldier standing guard outside Paul's cell. Paul is telling a church in writing that Jesus outranks all of it, every layer, including the empire currently holding him prisoner. Now, to understand how dangerous that claim actually was, you need to know exactly who was sitting on the throne when Paul wrote those words. His name was Nero. Nero ruled Rome from about 54 to about 68 AD. And history has not been kind to him, for good reason. In the summer of the year 64, a massive fire broke out in Rome and burned for the better part of 9 days. When it was finally out, only 4 of the city's 14 districts had been left untouched. 3 were leveled completely. The rest were scarred with the burned-out shells of buildings. Rumors started almost immediately that Nero himself had ordered the fire be set. Some said to clear land for a lavish new palace he wanted to build. And we can't prove that with certainty, and serious historians still debate exactly how much of that rumor was fair. But here's what we don't have to guess about, because we have it from a Roman source, not a Christian one. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing about 50 years after the fire, tells us plainly what happened next. Nero needed the rumors about him to stop, so he found someone else to blame. Tacitus writes that Nero fastened the guilt on a group that the Roman crowds already found strange and unsettling, a group Tacitus calls a class hated for their abominations. People who followed a man named Christus, who had been executed years earlier under Pontius Pilate. People the city had started calling Christians. And Tacitus does not soften what came next. He describes it in detail most of us never heard in Sunday school. Christians were sewn into the skins of wild animals and torn apart by dogs in public. Some were nailed to crosses, and some, and this is the detail behind our episode title, were coated in tar or wax, tied to stakes, and set on fire after dark to illuminate the streets and Nero's own gardens while he hosted parties among them. Human beings burning, used as nightlights and streetlights. Tacitus himself, a Roman writer with no love for Christians and no reason to make them look sympathetic, still calls what happened to them cruel enough that even hardened Romans started to feel pity. Not because the victims were innocent of every crime, he says, but because it seemed like they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty. That is the empire Paul's readers were living under when this letter arrived in Ephesus. Now, you might be listening to this and thinking, okay, that's Rome. That's a capital city hundreds of miles away. Did any of that actually touch Ephesus? Or is this just scene setting from somewhere else? That's a fair question. And I want to be honest with you about the limits of what we know, because this is a show for people who'd rather have the real picture than a tidy one. We don't have a Roman record that says soldiers showed up in Ephesus itself and rounded up Christians the week this letter arrived. The worst of Nero's persecution that Tacitus describes is centered in Rome. But here's what we do know, and it's enough to change how you hear this letter. News like this would travel. An empire this connected by roads and shipping lanes did not keep a spectacle like burning human beings for garden lighting a secret in the capital and nowhere else. Ephesus was one of the best connected port cities in the empire. Sailors, merchants, and officials moved constantly between Rome and Asia Minor. And more importantly, Everyone in Ephesus already knew in their bones what Rome was capable of doing to people that it decided were disloyal or dangerous. You didn't need soldiers at your own door to understand exactly what this empire would do to you if it turned its attention your way. The fear was ambient. It was in the air of every city under Roman rule, whether or not the flames had reached your street yet. Now, layer one more thing on top of that, because this is the piece that makes Jesus is Lord specifically dangerous, not just uncomfortable. Across the Roman world, and specifically in the province where Ephesus sat, emperor worship was becoming a normal, expected part of civic life. It had started decades earlier, under Augustus, as something close to genuine gratitude. Temples went up honoring Rome and the emperor as a way of thanking the empire for peace and stability. But by the time of Nero, in city after city across Asia Minor, that gratitude had hardened into something closer to a loyalty test. The expected phrase, the one you were supposed to say, sometimes while offering a pinch of incense in the public square, was simple. Caesar Kyrios. Caesar is Lord. Saying it wasn't really about what you privately believed about the emperor's divinity. It was a pledge, a way of proving publicly that you belonged, that you were loyal, that you weren't a threat. Refusing to say it marked you as suspicious at best and disloyal at worst. It's worth being precise here because this show cares about getting the history right, not just the drama. The enormous temple that Ephesus would eventually build specifically to the emperor cult, the one archaeologists have uncovered the remains of, that went up a few decades after Paul wrote this letter, under a later emperor named Domitian. So we shouldn't picture Paul's first readers walking past that exact building every day. But the practice and the pressure were already very real in his lifetime. Temples to Rome and the emperor already stood in nearby cities like Pergamum and Smyrna. Nero himself, by multiple ancient accounts, expected to be honored as something close to divine while he lived. And the underlying expectation that ultimate loyalty belonged to Caesar, and you said so out loud, that was already the water everyone in Ephesus was swimming in. So now put yourself in that room in Ephesus, hearing this letter from Paul read aloud for the first time. You live in a city that worships an emperor who, within recent memory, blamed people like you for burning down his own capital and had them torn apart by animals and set on fire as party lighting. You know exactly what happens to people who are seen as disloyal to Rome. And you know the phrase you're supposed to say out loud in public to prove you're not one of them. Caesar is Lord. Now this letter arrives from a man currently sitting in a Roman prison cell for the very faith he's writing about. And he tells you that Jesus is seated far above all rule and authority, that God has put all things under his feet, that Jesus is the head over everything for the sake of the church. Do you hear it now? Paul isn't offering you a nice devotional thought. He's handing a frightened, watched, potentially targeted group of people a rewrite of the empire's loyalty oath. Not Caesar is Lord. Jesus is Lord. And he's doing it in writing, in a letter that could be read by the wrong person, from a cell that proves he already knows exactly what saying something like this can cost. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. Paul doesn't tell this church to fight back. He doesn't tell them to organize a resistance or to riot or to try to overthrow Rome by force. Later in the same letter, he tells them to live quiet, faithful, generous lives, to be good neighbors, good spouses, good workers. He is not asking for a revolution in the streets. He's asking for a revolution in their understanding of who actually holds the highest seat of power in the universe. Because if you actually believe that, if you believe Jesus is already enthroned above every rule and authority, including the one currently threatening you, then Nero stops looking quite so large. Frightening? Yes. Dangerous? Absolutely. But not ultimate. Not final. Not the highest thing in the room. Nero's Rome, for all its power that day, did not last. Nero himself would be dead within a few years, forced to take his own life after the Senate turned against him. The empire that could turn a person into a human torch collapsed under the weight of its own excess. And this letter, written by a prisoner most people in his own century would never have heard of, is still being read in hundreds of languages 2,000 years later. So here's why this matters for you and me. Whether or not anyone is threatening to burn our neighborhood down. Most of us aren't living under an emperor who might turn us into party lighting. But most of us are living under something that currently feels like the most powerful, most permanent force in the room. An anxiety that won't quiet down. A diagnosis. Boss who controls your paycheck and wants you to know it. A culture that tells you exactly what you're supposed to say out loud to prove you belong. Ephesians was written to people staring directly at the most dominant, most terrifying power structure on earth and being told, not glibly, not from a place of safety, but from a prison cell, that it is not actually the highest thing there is. Not even close. That's not a throwaway comfort tacked onto the end of a rough week. It's a claim made by a man in chains about where real authority actually sits. And it was written to people who had every reason in the world to believe otherwise. A phrase that sounds like a bumper sticker to us cost everything to the people who first wrote it and first said it out loud. Jesus' Lord wasn't decoration. It was defiance. Quiet, costly, and confident that the empire currently holding all the cards was not, in the end, holding the winning hand. Now, it makes sense. Next week, we'll go back to another letter, another city, and another detail hiding in plain sight that most of us have read right past. Wherever you are, whatever you believe or don't, and whatever powerful thing currently feels unshakable in your life, you're welcome here. God can handle your questions. This is the place for them.